When I was a kid, I remember asking my uncle why he never talked about the war. He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window for a while, like he was watching something I couldn't see. Then he said, "Because we thought we could sit it out. We thought the world would burn, and we'd just watch from the porch." Before the Second World War, America wasn't looking outward. We were looking inward, trying to rebuild from the Great Depression, trying to keep food on the table, trying to believe the hard times were almost over. Across the oceans, things were shifting, but to most Americans it still felt far away. Germany, Japan, Italy. They were names in the paper headlines on the radio. Dictators with strange mustaches and marching crowds. But not here. Not home. We'd already fought our great war, sent our boys over there, buried them under white crosses. We didn't want another. And so we stayed quiet. We passed neutrality laws. We minded our business. But storms do not care about borders. And the fire was spreading step by step, speech by speech, invasion by invasion. Most folks didn't see it coming. Some refused to see it at all. But in time, even the oceans wouldn't be enough to keep the storm away. And when it reached us, it did not knock on the door. It kicked it open. Across the ocean, fires rise. It started slowly, like a bad wind, drifting across the ocean. Not loud, just steady. And at first, most Americans hardly noticed. Germany, after World War I, had been left humiliated and broken. The Treaty of Versailles stripped it of land, dignity, and money it didn't have. People starved, banks collapsed, and in that emptiness, a voice rose, a voice that promised to make Germany proud again. Adolf Hitler. He didn't come from power. He seized it speech by speech, fear by fear. First came the words, then the uniforms, the swastika flags, the shouting crowds, and then the laws against Jews, against opposition, against truth. Across the sea, we heard echoes of it. But echoes don't always sound like alarms. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was already building his fascist state, all black shirts and empire dreams. And in Japan, military leaders grew bold, marching into Manchuria, then China carving out space with rifles and fire. Still, America stayed home. We passed neutrality acts, told ourselves we would not get involved. No weapons to countries at war, no loans, no entanglements. We were tired of the world's problems. Even when Germany marched into Austria in 1938, annexing it without firing a shot, there was no intervention, just headlines and nervous diplomats. Then came Czechoslovakia, then Poland. And on September 1st, 1939, Hitler's tanks rolled in like steel thunder. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. But we still didn't join. President Roosevelt wanted to help. Quietly, he pushed Congress to support the Allies. We sold supplies, traded old destroyers for naval bases, called it Lend-Lease, but we knew what it really meant. Still, public opinion stayed cautious. No more boys to Europe. Not again. Then came France's fall in 1940. Fast, brutal, unbelievable. Then the blitz night after night of German bombs, pounding London children, hiding in train tunnels, while fires lit the sky, and something started to shift. Americans began listening more closely to the radio, following the war maps in newspapers, wondering if the storm would stay on the other side of the ocean. Roosevelt in his fireside chats called us the arsenal of democracy. He said the world's fate was being written, and America had to help write it. But the clock was still ticking, and across the Pacific, Japan was watching too, watching how slow we were to move, how cautious we were to fight. And soon they would make their move, not in Europe, but in the Pacific, at a quiet naval base called Pearl Harbor. Day of Infamy. It was a Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The sky above Pearl Harbor was blue and soft, the kind of sky that makes you think nothing bad could happen. Sailors were still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Some were writing letters home. Others stood in line for breakfast, maybe thinking about a football game later that day. Then, the sky changed. At first it was the sound, a hum, low and growing. Then shadows moved overhead. And before anyone could reach for a weapon or a radio, the world erupted. Bombs, torpedoes, fire, steel. The Japanese attack came in 2 waves, fast and precise. They had practiced it for months down to the minute. Their goal was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and in 90 minutes they nearly did. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to her ammunition magazine. She exploded with such force that her hull lifted from the water. Over 100 men died aboard her in less than 10 minutes. The Oklahoma capsized. Other battleships burned or sank in place, their crews scrambling through smoke and oil. Men dove into the harbor to escape the flames, only to find the water itself was on fire. It was chaos, but not confusion. The attack was clear, intentional, measured. Back on the mainland, radios crackled to life, interrupting sermons, quiet breakfasts, walks in the park. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a special news bulletin. And just like that, the storm we thought we could avoid was suddenly right in our living rooms. The next day, President Roosevelt stood before Congress. His voice was calm, but edged with iron. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. In just a few minutes, the vote was cast. Only one voice, Jeanette Rankin, a congresswoman from Montana, voted against war. The rest of the country united in fury. Enlistment offices were overwhelmed. Young men lined up around the block. Factories turned on overnight. Neighborhoods hung flags in windows with blue stars, some with gold. And in Tokyo, they knew the window was closing. They had hoped America would negotiate, hesitate, freeze in shock. But instead, America woke up. And when we did not just join the war. We became the war. For every bomb that fell on Pearl Harbor, 1,000 boots would cross oceans. For every ship that sank, 12 would rise in its place. The sleeping giant was awake now, and the fight had only just begun. A nation mobilizes. The morning after Pearl Harbor, everything felt different. The newspapers were still wet with ink when people grabbed them off porches, wide-eyed and silent. Headlines screamed in bold war. People did not read them once. They read them over and over as if understanding the words might make them sting less. But the shock didn't last. The country didn't freeze. It moved, and it moved fast. Within days, factories that once built cars started turning out tanks. Sewing machines gave way to uniforms. Typewriters became rifles. Entire assembly lines were torn down and rebuilt in weeks because time was not a luxury anymore. They called it the arsenal of democracy, and it was not just a phrase, it was a fact. In Detroit, Henry Ford's Willow Run plant rolled out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. That is not an exaggeration. From raw metal to roaring engine, all under one roof. Day and night, without pause. In California, shipyards filled with workers, men too old to serve boys barely out of school, and women who had never touched a wrench before. They became welders, riveters, and electricians. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was real. She lived next door. She packed her lunch in wax paper and learned how to read blueprints. At home, people planted victory gardens in backyards and window boxes. They saved bacon grease for ammunition factories. Children collected scrap metal in wagons. Housewives lined up for ration books, gasoline, sugar, coffee, rubber. Everyone gave something, because everyone felt the weight of it. And while millions were heading off to war, the war was also arriving at home. Air raid drills became routine. Cities dimmed their lights at night. In some towns, people painted their windows with blackout curtains and hoped the bombs would never come. Across the country, draft boards spun into action. Letters arrived short and cold. You are hereby ordered for induction. Some men cried. Some cheered. Most just packed a bag and kissed their mother or wife or girl on the porch. They had seen what happened at Pearl Harbor. They had no illusions. They knew they might not come back. But they went anyway. More than 16 million Americans would wear the uniform during World War II, and behind every one of them stood the rest of the country shoveling coal, spinning steel saving string, and praying quietly for peace. This was not just a war of soldiers. It was a war of citizens, a whole nation caught in the gears of history, and none of it would ever be the same again. The enemy at home. The war brought unity, but it also brought fear. And fear, if left to grow in the dark, can twist even the most familiar places into something unrecognizable. After Pearl Harbor, the country was angry, but it was also afraid. Afraid of spies, sabotage, secret sympathizers hiding in plain sight, and for thousands of innocent Americans that fear would turn their world upside down. If you had a Japanese last name, it didn't matter if you were born in California, spoke perfect English, or had never set foot in Japan. In the eyes of the government, you were suddenly a potential threat. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It gave the military power to declare certain areas off limits and to remove anyone they chose. They chose Japanese Americans. Within weeks, notices were nailed to telephone poles. All persons of Japanese ancestry must report. And just like that, families packed what they could carry. They left behind homes, farms, shops, pets. Many locked their doors thinking they'd be back in a few days. Most never returned. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, were sent to relocation centers in remote corners of the country. Deserts, swamps, barracks built in haste, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. It wasn't prison, but it wasn't freedom either. They slept on cots, lined up for food, tried to make schools out of empty rooms. Some volunteered to fight for the very country that had locked them away. And fight they did. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Their motto was simple: go for broke. While their parents and siblings were behind fences in America, they were charging up hills in Italy, rescuing trapped battalions in France. But it wasn't just Japanese Americans who felt the shadow of suspicion. German and Italian immigrants were monitored too. Some were detained. Others were forced to register with local authorities. Radio stations were shut down. German-language newspapers disappeared. In schools, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. German shepherds became Alsatians. And once again, the country struggled to balance its fear with its values. Yet for all the darkness, there were moments of light. Neighbors who stored belongings for interned families. Teachers who slipped students encouraging notes. Churches that quietly raised money for legal defense. History is rarely clean. Even as America fought for freedom overseas, we were still learning what freedom meant at home. And for many, the scars of those years would outlast the war itself. Because the enemy we feared across the ocean was sometimes easier to face than the one we found in our own reflection. The arsenal of democracy. You could hear it before you saw it. The clang of steel, the hiss of steam, the steady hum of machines running through the night. From Pittsburgh to Seattle, from Detroit to Dallas, the United States became something it had never been before: a war machine. But this was not a country built on conquest. It was a country built on invention. And now every factory, every warehouse, every workshop became a piece of a larger engine. One built not to take over the world, but to stop someone else from doing just that. We called it the arsenal of democracy, and the phrase stuck because it felt true. Ford stopped making cars and started making bombers. Chrysler turned out tanks. General Electric made engines for warplanes. Shipyards in California and Maine produced vessels faster than anyone thought possible. In 1941, the United States produced about 3,000 airplanes. By 1944, we were producing nearly 100,000 a year. And it was not just men behind those machines. With millions of able-bodied men overseas, women stepped into the roles they were never invited into before. They rolled up their sleeves, tied back their hair, and went to work. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a slogan. She was real. She had grease under her nails and calluses on her hands. She built B-17s and Liberty ships. And when the whistle blew, she wiped her brow and went home to cook dinner. In some factories, whole floors were run by women. Black women, white women, immigrant women, all working side by side, learning fast, working harder. And then there were the men who couldn't serve the too old, the too young, the disabled. They drove forklifts, they swept floors, they loaded trains. Everyone found a way to help. Even school children joined in. They ran scrap drives collecting tin rubber paper and old aluminum. They turned bacon grease into explosives. They saved coins in war bond books. They watched the newsreels at the movies and memorized the names of battles on faraway islands. In every town, people rationed: coffee, sugar, butter, tires. Families shared cars, planted gardens, waited in line without complaint. Because the goal wasn't comfort, the goal was victory. And for the first time, Americans felt what it meant to fight a war together, even if they never saw a battlefield. Factories ran day and night. Trains roared across the plains, heavy with steel and promise. Posters lined every wall, reminding people: loose lips sink ships. Do your part. We can do it. And we did. What the Nazis in Imperial Japan had not counted on was this: that America, once awakened, would not simply fight. It would outproduce, outbuild, and outlast. Our soldiers crossed oceans, but it was our welders, our machinists, our riveters, those on the home front, who gave them the tools to win. And the sound of those tools grinding, hammering, spinning, that was the sound of democracy being defended, one bolt at a time. The Pacific bleeds. The maps do not show the heat. They do not show the salt in the air, the flies in your food, or the weight of a rifle soaked in rain. But for the American soldiers sent to fight across the Pacific, the war was not lines and arrows. It was islands, and blood, and time that stretched endlessly between bullets. After Pearl Harbor, Japan had the momentum. They seized Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and more. They moved fast, too fast for most to believe. In April 1942, a group of American bombers under Jimmy Doolittle took off from an aircraft carrier, something no one thought possible, and bombed Tokyo. It didn't change the course of the war, but it told Japan, we're coming. Still, early battles were brutal. At Bataan, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered after holding out for months. They were promised humane treatment. Instead, they were marched 60 miles without food or water in the tropical heat. Thousands died on the way. They called it the Bataan Death March, and it was just the beginning. In June 1942, the tide began to shift. At Midway, the U.S. Navy, outnumbered and outgunned, broke Japanese codes and launched a daring ambush. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. It was the first time Japan had truly lost, and it changed everything. From there, America began the long, grueling climb across the Pacific island, hopping they called it. First Guadalcanal, then Tarawa, then Saipan, Peleliulete, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each island a nightmare. No rear lines, no safe zones. Every yard had to be taken by foot, by flame, by bayonet. And the enemy, they did not surrender. They fought to the last man. Sometimes they charged with nothing but knives and desperation. Jungle rot ate through boots. Malaria and dysentery thinned ranks as surely as bullets. Letters home were soaked in sweat, or not written at all. Some nights the ocean was quiet, just the sound of waves, and then machine guns, screaming explosions from a dark hill where you thought no one was left. And for the Marines and soldiers, there the question wasn't just, will I survive? It was, is anyone even watching? Because Europe got the headlines. Europe had Churchill and Paris and ancient cities. But in the Pacific it was coral heat and silence. And yet the men kept going, kept landing on beach after beach, because they understood what was at stake. Japan had started this war in a blaze of ambition, but America was determined to finish it. No matter how many miles, no matter how many names carved into stone, the Pacific bled, and we bled with it. But we kept moving forward, one island at a time. Storm over Africa. Before the beaches of Normandy, before the fall of Berlin, American boots touched foreign sand in a place ancient and harsh, North Africa. It was not the war most Americans expected. There were no grand cities to liberate, no sweeping forests. Just dust, heat, endless desert. But it was the first true test of American ground troops against Hitler's forces, and it would shape everything that came after. In November 1942, Operation Torch began. Tens of thousands of American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, aiming to squeeze the German Afrika Korps between Allied pincers. They were met with more than just resistance. They were met by one of Germany's best field marshal, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. He was clever, fast, unpredictable. His tanks moved like they had their own instincts. The Americans, fresh and untested, made mistakes. At Kasserine Pass, they were routed, ambushed in narrow valleys, their lines shattered. Men panicked. Supplies vanished. Command broke down. It was our first real taste of how hard this war would be. And it hurt. But Americans don't stay down long. From that failure came focus. New leadership, General George S. Patton, brash, relentless, unforgiving. He believed in discipline, in speed, and in fighting with everything you had. His men hated him and followed him because he got results. By May 1943, the tide had turned. Rommel's army, cut off, outgunned, was driven out. North Africa was ours, but victory came at a cost. The desert claimed thousands of lives. Heat stroke, shrapnel, sniper fire from ridgelines you couldn't even see, and always the sand grinding into boots, rations, wounds. Still, it was a turning point. The Allies had proven they could fight the Germans head-on. More importantly, they'd learned how to fight together. American, British, Free French forces sometimes arguing, sometimes miscommunicating, but moving forward. And from the shores of Tunisia, a new horizon appeared. Europe, but not through France. Not yet. First, they would aim for the soft underbelly of the Axis, Italy, a place of mountains and mines, ancient towns and modern resistance. But that's a story for another day. For now, the desert winds died down. The guns cooled. And America, a little older, a little wiser, looked toward the next chapter in a war that was just getting started. The home front. Back home, the war was everywhere, even if you never heard a shot fired. It was in the shop windows where posters reminded you to buy war bonds. It was in the grocery line where ration stamps were counted like coins. It was on the radio in the movie theaters, in your neighbor's empty driveway. Because everyone was part of the fight. In the cities you heard it in the rhythm of the factories. Steam whistles, shouting foremen, trains rumbling with tanks and crates of ammo. On the night shift, women stood beside men on the line's hands, black with grease, humming swing songs to stay awake. In small towns, life changed too. Children brought scrap metal to school in wagons. Boy Scouts collected paper. Old men gathered rubber from their garages. Even bacon grease was saved for bomb making, they said. At dinner, families used margarine instead of butter. Cups of sugar were measured carefully. Coffee was precious. Shoes had to last. Everyone had ration books. Everyone knew what Meatless Tuesday meant. And on the mantel or pinned to a curtain, families hung service flags, a blue star for each loved one serving. Sometimes the stars turned gold. It was a quiet kind of courage. A mother checking the mail each morning, heart pounding. A father holding back tears in front of the kids. A teenager working 2 jobs while waiting for the draft. And through it all, America was changing. Black Americans, still facing segregation and discrimination, took jobs in factories, served in segregated units, and pushed hard for the Double V campaign victory abroad and victory at home for civil rights. Women, after years of being told where their place was, proved they could do everything and more. By 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women was working outside the home. People moved, from the south to the north, from farms to cities, chasing defense contracts, filling labor shortages. Entire neighborhoods sprang up around shipyards and airplane plants. Some nights when the news was good, you'd hear the laughter at the soda shop. Other nights when telegrams arrived, towns went quiet. At the movies, you saw newsreels before the feature troops marching in France, ships launching from the Pacific, and always the message was the same. We're in this together. It wasn't easy, but it was united. And even though the war felt far away, across oceans, in jungles and deserts and cities, with names most Americans had never heard before, it was also right here, in the blackout curtains, in the empty seat at the table, in the hope that someday soon the war would end and everyone would come home. But before that could happen, we had to fight through Europe, and that meant stepping onto another shore, this time in a place called Italy. Italy falls. Italy was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe. That's what Churchill called it. But when the Allies landed there, they found out it was more like a clenched fist. It began in July 1943, when American and British troops stormed the beaches of Sicily. Hot winds stoned villages' olive trees. They expected resistance, but not from the land itself. The roads were narrow, the mountains were steep, and the enemy seasoned German troops under Field Marshal Kesselring fought like they had nowhere else to go. Still, Sicily fell. And then something unexpected happened. Mussolini was overthrown. Italians turned on him overnight. The man who had promised a 1,000-year empire was now hidden away in a mountain prison. And Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. But Germany didn't let go. Hitler sent divisions south, took control of Italian defenses, and turned the whole peninsula into a fortress. And so the fight for Italy began inch by inch, hill by hill, In September 1943, the Allies landed at Salerno. Then came Naples, and then the push north toward Rome. The weather was brutal. Rains turned fields to swamps. Mud swallowed tanks. The cold made rifles feel like ice. And always the mountains. So many mountains. The worst was Monte Cassino, a towering monastery turned German stronghold. For months, Allied forces battered it. Artillery thundered, day and night. When the monastery was finally destroyed, it didn't stop the fighting. It just buried it under more rubble. American, British, French, Polish, Canadian troops. They all passed through Italy. They all bled there. In Anzio, American troops landed behind enemy lines, only to get stuck for months under heavy fire. It was called the beachhead of hell. And yet through it all, they moved forward. Rome was liberated in June 1944, but by then, much of the world's attention had shifted to the beaches of Normandy, to the invasion of France. The Italian campaign became the war's forgotten front, but the soldiers who fought there never forgot. They remembered the cold, the sound of mortars echoing through valleys, the sight of white crosses stretching across mountain slopes. Italy wasn't soft. It was stone and fire and grit. And though it didn't end the war, it weakened. The Axis drew German forces away from France and taught the Allies one more hard lesson. There would be no easy victory. Europe would have to be taken the hard way, step by step, and the next step was across the English Channel. Prelude to invasion. By early 1944, the world was holding its breath. The Allies had taken North Africa. They were pushing through Italy. The Soviets were bleeding the Germans on the Eastern Front. But to truly crack Hitler's fortress, one thing had to happen. Western Europe had to be invaded, and for that, the Allies turned their eyes to France. Specifically a stretch of coastline in Normandy, wind-swept cold, watched closely by German guns. The planning began months in advance. It wasn't just maps and troop numbers. It was deception, secrecy, precision. The operation was called Overlord, and the day it would begin, D-Day. But before any boots could hit the sand, the Allies had to prepare, physically, emotionally, logistically. In the quiet villages of southern England, American and British troops trained day and night. They practiced beach landings on pebble shores. They learned how to dig in under fire, how to move when mortars fell, how to trust each other without words. For many of them, it was their first time overseas. They were kids from Ohio, Texas, New York, far from home writing letters, under cloudy skies, waiting for the word to go. And behind the scenes, the scale of preparation was staggering. More than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops would be part of the first wave alone. Entire fake armies were created, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, phony radio traffic, to trick the Germans into thinking the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Even General George Patton, the Germans' most feared commander, was used as a decoy, placed in England, commanding ghost troops. And still no one knew if it would work. The weather had to be just right. The tide had to be low enough for landing craft. The moonlight had to guide the paratroopers. One storm could cancel everything. The tension in the camps grew heavy. Men played cards, drank coffee, wrote notes home and didn't sign them. Some couldn't sleep. Others slept like stones. Then came the night of June 5th. Eisenhower, calm, quiet, gave the order. Okay, let's go. And just like that, the greatest amphibious assault in history was set in motion. As night fell, paratroopers climbed into planes. Gliders launched into darkness. Naval convoys began to move engines, humming beneath the waves. No one knew what would happen next. Only that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Something that might change the course of the entire war. And by morning, They would be storming the beaches under fire, under sky, under the weight of the world. D-Day. The longest day morning came slowly on June 6, 1944, gray, cold, and heavy with fog. But by then, the invasion was already underway. American, British, and Canadian paratroopers had dropped behind enemy lines hours before, drifting silently into fields and orchards across Normandy. Some landed miles from their targets. Others touched down in swamps or on rooftops. But they fought confused, scattered, improvising. They blew bridges, cut wires, captured crossroads. Then, at dawn, the sea came alive. From the decks of more than 5,000 ships, soldiers looked toward the French coast. 5 beaches, 5 code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. On the American side, it was Utah to the west, and Omaha just beside it. Utah went smoother than expected. Wrong landing zone, but fewer casualties. They fought inland with speed. But Omaha was a nightmare. The Germans were waiting. Machine guns in bunkers. Artillery dug into the cliffs. Miles of beach with no cover, just sand wire and the cold surf. As the ramps dropped, men ran straight into gunfire. Boats were blown apart before soldiers even touched shore. Bodies floated in the tide. The water turned red. Radio messages went silent. Officers were killed. Companies vanished. But they kept going, crawling over shingle, blasting gaps in barbed wire with satchel charges, pulling wounded men through the surf with bloodied hands. It took hours to break through, and by nightfall, Omaha was held but barely. All along the coast, similar stories played out. On Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian troops pushed inland. They met stiff resistance but gained ground. By the end of the day, more than 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. Thousands were dead or wounded. But the beachhead was established. It had taken years to plan, and just one long, terrible day to make it real. D-Day wasn't the end of the war, not even close. But it was the beginning of the end. The Nazis had lost their grip on Western Europe, and now there would be no safe place left for them to retreat. In towns across America, people huddled by radios. They heard the names Normandy, Omaha, Cannes, and they knew their sons were there. Mothers sat still in kitchens, fingers trembling on coffee mugs. Fathers stepped outside, lit cigarettes they didn't finish. No one knew who had made it. Not yet. But they knew the world had changed. The sea had opened, and the long road to Berlin had begun. Not with speeches, not with fanfare, but with wet boots, clenched jaws, and the stubborn courage of thousands who ran straight into the fire and kept going. Liberation and loss. After the beaches came the hedgerows. Normandy wasn't open fields and easy marches. It was tight country, hedgerow after hedgerow, ancient stone walls and thick greenery that turned every mile into a maze. The Germans had dug in. They knew the land. And for weeks after D-Day, the Allies fought for inches. Tanks couldn't see where they were going. Snipers hid behind vines. Machine guns waited around every bend. Men would clear one field, breathe, and then crawl into the next, where the process began all over again. But slowly, painfully, the Allies pushed forward. By July, they had taken St. Lo and opened a gap. Operation Cobra launched the breakout. American armor surged south, swinging fast and hard, cutting across France like a scythe. The German lines cracked, and then finally they broke. By August, Paris rose. It wasn't part of the plan. The Allies were focused on chasing the enemy, not liberating cities. But Parisians couldn't wait. The resistance fought in the streets. White flags hung from windows. And when American troops rolled into the capital, the city erupted. Tears, flowers, church bells. People cheered themselves hoarse. French girls kissed GIs on the cheeks. Civilians climbed on tanks waving flags. One soldier wrote home, "I've never seen joy like that." It didn't feel like victory. It felt like resurrection. But liberation came with a price. Every town taken had graves behind it. Every push forward meant letters that never got sent, birthdays that would be missed forever. Whole platoons were gone. Friends who shared foxholes didn't make it to the next field. In Belgium, in the Netherlands, the same pattern repeated: advance, fight, bury, repeat. And all the while, winter approached. Some units had been fighting since Sicily. Their boots were worn thin. Their uniforms still smelled of salt and mud from the Normandy coast. They were tired. But there was no turning back. Germany was in retreat. But the fight wasn't over. The Reich still held much of Europe, and Hitler still believed he could win. Back home, the headlines were optimistic: Paris liberated. But the casualty lists kept growing. Gold stars appeared in more windows, and the telegrams kept arriving, those short, cold messages that dropped like stones into kitchens and hearts. Victory was coming. But it would not come quietly. And before it did, the enemy would strike one more time, harder than anyone expected. In the freezing forests of the Ardennes, where the quiet would be shattered once again, and the war would take its darkest turn yet. The Bulge. In December of 1944, most American soldiers believed the war was nearly over. The Allies had broken through in France. Paris was free. German forces were retreating, and many hoped they'd be home by Christmas. But war doesn't listen to hope, and neither did Adolf Hitler. He had one last plan, one last gamble. If he could smash through the Allied lines in Belgium, drive west, split the British from the Americans, take the port of Antwerp, maybe he could force a peace. So in the quiet forests of the Ardennes, while the snow fell soft on pine branches, German tanks and troops gathered. No one thought they'd attack there. It was quiet, too cold. The American lines were thin. Young troops, many on their first tour, some without proper winter gear. They were resting, rotating out, waiting for the next move. Then, on December 16th, the woods exploded. Artillery rained down like thunder. Tanks rolled through the fog. Thousands of German soldiers surged forward, well-armed, well-prepared, and determined. The Allies were caught off guard. Whole units vanished. Snow-choked roads turned to chaos. One American wrote, "We didn't retreat. We fell back. Fast." It became known as the Battle of the Bulge, because on the maps, that's what the German advance looked like, a deep bulge in the Allied front line. But on the ground, it felt like disaster. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. Weapons jammed. Foxholes filled with snow. There were days when soldiers fired their rifles just to keep them from freezing shut. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, the 101st Airborne dug in. The Germans sent a message demanding surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe sent one back. One word: nuts. His men held the line. And then, out of the snow, came help. Patton's Third Army, having turned north with impossible speed, broke through the German siege just days after Christmas. Slowly, the Bulge began to shrink. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. But the cost was steep. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle American forces faced in World War II. Nearly 90,000 casualties. Some units were reduced to shadows. Entire towns were flattened. Bodies were buried in snowbanks, unnamed, unmourned for the moment. And yet, even in the worst of it, American troops held on. Not just with rifles, but with stubbornness. With letters home tucked in shirt pockets, with photos of sweethearts frozen in wallets, because they knew after this there would be no more major German offensives, no more surprise attacks. This was the Reich's last gasp, and as January thawed the snow, the Allies prepared for the final push. Germany was next. Berlin was in sight, and though the road was broken, frozen, and filled with ghosts, they would march it, together, all the way to the end. The fall of the Reich. By early 1945, the world felt tired. The war had raged for over 5 years. Cities lay in ruins. Fields were scorched. Families were scattered across continents. But the Allies were closing in. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed into Germany. From the east, the Soviets were pushing hard, driven by rage and loss. Millions dead. Cities like Stalingrad turned to ash. And in between, the German war machine was collapsing. But it did not go quietly. Even as the Allies advanced, Hitler ordered no retreat. Every village became a fortress. Every bridge was mined. Every day brought more desperate resistance. In March 1945, the Americans reached the Rhine River, that legendary barrier, once thought impossible to cross. But luck, or something like it, showed up in the form of a single standing bridge at Remagen. The Germans had tried to blow it up. It failed, and American troops poured across. It was the beginning of the end. Town after town fell, factories still smoking, rail yards twisted, German soldiers surrendering in groups, young and hollow-eyed. But with every step deeper into Germany, the truth of what the war really meant began to surface. The rumors had been circling for years. Whispers of camps, of mass graves, of something unspeakable. And then came the liberations. Buchenwald, Dachau, Ohrdruf, Bergen-Belsen. The sights broke men. Even the toughest GI's men, who had fought in Anzio, who had frozen in the Ardennes, stood silent, unable to make sense of what they saw. Emaciated survivors, rooms filled with shoes, piles of glasses, ash floating in the air like snow. These were not military targets. They were civilians, Jews, Poles, Romani, political prisoners. Millions murdered, not in battle, but by design. For many American soldiers, it changed everything. The war had always been about duty, honor, victory. Now it was about justice. On April 12, 1945, back in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died of a stroke. He had led America through the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, and nearly all of the war. He never saw its end. His replacement, Harry S. Truman, took office unsure, untested, and with the weight of the world on his shoulders. 3 weeks later, Adolf Hitler, hiding in a Berlin bunker, took his own life. The Reich he had dreamed of to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, and on May 8, 1945, the world exhaled. VE Day, victory in Europe. In Times Square, strangers kissed. In London, Churchill spoke beneath skies still streaked with smoke. In Berlin, silence. But for American troops, there was no wild celebration, no champagne on the front lines, just the knowledge that they had survived something immense, and that half a world away, another war was still burning. Because even as church bells rang in Paris, the Pacific was calling. And Japan was not done yet. Fire in the Pacific. While Europe was celebrating the fall of Hitler in the Pacific, the war was still full of fire and far from finished. The strategy was simple in theory, island by island closer to Japan. But in practice, it was brutal. Every island was a fortress, every beach a trap, every inch of ground paid for in blood. After victories in Saipan, Guam, and Leyte, the Americans turned their eyes to a speck in the Pacific, Iwo Jima. It was just 8 square miles. But it sat halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, and the Japanese were dug in deep. Miles of tunnels, hidden bunkers, artillery buried in volcanic rock. When the Marines landed in February 1945, they were met with silence, at first. Then, a wall of fire. Iwo Jima became a nightmare. The volcanic ash made it impossible to dig. Wounded men couldn't find cover. Machine guns fired from positions you couldn't even see. It took 5 weeks to take the island. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. More than 19,000 were wounded. The image that stayed the one carved into stone and memory was of 6 Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. But behind that photo was a battlefield that smelled of smoke, blood, and sulfur. And even worse was yet to come. In April, the Allies launched the assault on Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. Over 180,000 Allied troops. The Japanese had over 100,000 defenders. Many of them knew they wouldn't leave the island alive. The fighting lasted nearly 3 months. Rain turned hills into rivers of mud. Kamikaze pilots dove into ships by the hundreds. Foxholes filled with water, then with fire. Civilians were caught in the middle, some forced to fight others, trapped in caves as the shells fell. By the time it ended in June 1945, more than 12,000 Americans were dead, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had perished. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and it raised a terrible question. If this was what one island cost, what would it take to invade Japan itself? Military planners estimated as many as 1 million Allied casualties if the invasion went forward. The Japanese military was prepared to fight to the last man, woman, and child. There would be no surrender. And as American B-29s firebombed Tokyo and other cities, flattening neighborhoods, killing tens of thousands overnight, it still wasn't enough to bring Japan to its knees. President Truman, just months into office, faced a decision that no leader had ever faced before. In secret labs, scientists had built something new, something terrible. A weapon that could end the war in days, or rewrite history in seconds. And soon, the sky over Japan would split open, and the world would change forever. The atomic end. It began not on a battlefield, but in the quiet deserts of New Mexico. In July 1945, under the codename Trinity, the United States tested the world's first atomic bomb. The scientists who had worked on it, Einstein's peers, refugees from fascism minds shaped by curiosity and war, watched in awe and dread as the sky lit up like a second sun. One whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." They had done the impossible. And now, the impossible had to be used. Germany was gone. But Japan was still fighting. And every signal said they would not stop. No surrender. No compromise. So President Truman made the call, a decision unlike any other in human history. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. It was called Little Boy. The explosion erased the city center in seconds, a fireball hotter than the sun. Buildings melted, shadows burned into stone. In a flash, over 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die from burns injuries and radiation in the weeks to come. 3 days later, Japan still had not surrendered. So the U.S. dropped a second bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. Another city leveled. Another 40,000 lives gone in an instant. The devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. And suddenly, everyone from generals to civilians understood. This was a new kind of war, one that could end entire nations in the time it took to draw a breath. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito, addressed his people, many hearing his voice for the first time. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur stood nearby. American sailors watched from the decks, and the world exhaled again, this time for real. After nearly 6 years, after 60 million lives lost, after battles from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of Belgium to the jungles of the Pacific, World War II was finished. But the bomb had changed everything. There was no going back, no unknowing what had been done, no pretending that mankind hadn't just invented a weapon that could end itself. And while some celebrated in the streets, dancing, crying, kissing strangers under ticker tape, others stood silent, staring at newspaper photos of mushroom clouds, wondering what came next. Victory had come, but not clean, not easy, and not without a price that would echo for generations. The world was free from fascism, but it was no longer innocent. Coming home to a new world. When the fighting stopped, the world didn't fall silent. It held its breath. For the millions of American soldiers overseas, victory didn't mean instant peace. It meant waiting, processing, packing up a life lived in mudfire and foreign languages, and somehow trying to return to a country that had kept on moving without them. They called it demobilization, but to most, it felt like simply coming home. Trains rolled into towns, both big and small. Mothers clutched telegrams in trembling hands. Children squinted at the tall figures, stepping off the platforms, trying to recognize the fathers they barely remembered. For some, it was hugs and tears and homemade pies. For others, it was quieter, strange, joy mixed with distance, because the war changed people, and not everyone came back whole. There were empty chairs at dinner tables. There were men who couldn't sleep through thunderstorms, or walk into crowds, or smile the way they used to. There were wounds no bandage could fix. The GIs returned with medals, with stories, with shadows, and they came back to a country bursting with new energy. The factories that had once turned out tanks now made refrigerators. Homes sprouted in the suburbs like spring grass. The GI Bill sent veterans to college, helped them buy homes, start families. The baby boom began. America was stronger, richer, more confident than ever. But under the surface, new tensions stirred. Women who had proven their strength in wartime jobs were told to go home. Black Americans who had fought bravely overseas came back to Jim Crow laws and separate water fountains. Many began asking loudly, rightfully, why they had fought for freedom abroad if they still couldn't find it at home. It was a nation on the edge of transformation. And then there was the bomb. The atomic shadow loomed over everything. The war had ended with 2 flashes of light and 2 clouds rising into the sky, and now the world knew it could never go back. The Soviet Union, once an uneasy ally, was now a looming rival. Lines were already being drawn, Berlin, Korea, the beginnings of what would become a long and quiet war with no clear front. But back in kitchens and living rooms, people weren't thinking about geopolitics. They were trying to fall in love again, to sleep without the sound of mortars, to build a life from the pieces that were left. Veterans told stories, or they didn't. Photographs were framed, letters tucked into drawers, and the country moved forward carrying the memory of what it had done and what it had lost. Because World War II wasn't just a moment in time, it was a dividing line. Before it, America was still finding its feet. After it, America stood, tall, powerful, complicated, bruised, and unshakable. The war was over. But its story, that was only beginning. The legacy of sacrifice. Years passed. Uniforms were boxed away. Names faded from headlines. But World War II never truly left. It echoed in stories told around dinner tables, in worn black and white photos, in the way old veterans stood a little straighter when the national anthem played. More than 400,000 Americans never came home from that war. Their graves are scattered across France, Belgium, the Philippines, and small-town cemeteries, from Ohio to Oklahoma. White crosses, stars of David, quiet markers of lives cut short so that others might live free. And those who did return, they built the world we live in now. They became teachers, truck drivers, senators, and civil rights leaders. They filled classrooms, started businesses, raised children, and quietly kept the country going. Some bore their scars in silence. Others marched for change, believing that the country they had bled for could and should be better, because they had seen the cost of tyranny. And they believed America could be more than just strong, it could be just. Their war shaped everything that came after. It launched the United Nations, a global attempt at peace. It transformed American industry, science, and medicine. It gave rise to the suburbs, the middle class, and eventually the civil rights movement. And the world never looked the same again. Germany was split, Japan was rebuilt, empires crumbled, new nations rose, and over it all loomed the nuclear shadow. The knowledge that one war had ended, but another colder one had begun. Even now, all these years later, we still live in the world that war made. When we talk about democracy or alliance or freedom, we echo 1945. When we raise our voices against oppression or stand beside our allies, we carry the spirit of Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Bastogne. It's not about glorifying war. War is pain and fire and final goodbyes. But it is about remembering, because memory is how we protect the future. We remember the soldiers in foxholes, the pilots in burning skies, the nurses in field tents, the families waiting by radios, the teenagers who lied about their age to serve, the children who grew up too fast. And we remember, not because they were perfect, but because they were human, and they gave more than most of us will ever be asked to give. Their legacy lives in more than textbooks. It lives in the choices we make, the freedoms we defend, and the peace we try every day to preserve. The war ended, but its meaning never did. Good night and thank you. My grandfather never talked much about the war. He kept an old trunk in the attic. Inside a faded uniform, a few medals, some black and white photos that smelled like time. I remember once asking him, when I was a kid, was it scary? He just smiled a little and said, some things are too big to be scared of. You just get through them. And maybe that's how a lot of them felt. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They didn't ask for statues or parades. They came home, hung up their jackets, and went back to work, raising families, building roads, voting, coaching Little League. But their fingerprints are everywhere. In the world they helped save, in the peace they fought for, in the freedom they protected, often with everything they had. We tell their story not to glorify war, but to remember the cost of peace. Because history doesn't live in dates or headlines. It lives in people, in choices, in quiet courage. So tonight, if you're still listening, still awake, know this. You've walked with soldiers across stormy beaches. You've flown through fire in midnight skies. You've stood in the snow in Belgium, in the mud of the Pacific, in the rubble of Berlin. You've seen bravery, and grief, and grace. And maybe in some small way you've understood why that war changed everything. If you ever meet someone who served, thank them. If you lost someone who served, remember them. And if you've only heard their stories, carry them. Because peace isn't guaranteed. It's earned and kept by people like them and people like you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Sleep well tonight. And good night from someone who's glad you came along for the story.